They will tell you it was just a rancher, a madman hidden in the dry winds of Colorado, 1870. They will whisper of a man who gathered his wife and children, led them into the earth, and buried them alive beneath his own land. But what they will not tell you, what history was ordered to forget, is why. Why a man with acres of open sky and freedom at his fingertips would choose suffocation in soil over life in the sun. This is not simply the tale of one family's grave. This is the story of a system so ancient, so ruthless, it bends men's minds until the unthinkable becomes inevitable. Picture the scene. The prairie stretched wide and endless, the silence of Colorado's frontier, broken only by the creak of wooden beams and the crack of the shovel. Neighbors said he dug for days, his hands blistered raw, his face ghostly and unblinking. He told them it was for storage, a cellar, a place to keep meat from rotting, and they believed him, because the truth would have been unbearable. That cellar was no cellar. It was a coffin, wide enough for a family. You are not hearing this by chance. Stories like this are not meant to reach the public. They are tucked away in archives, mislabeled, dismissed as rumor, hidden under the dust of local legend. But legends are not born from nothing. They are scars, fragments of reality burned into the collective memory of a place. Ask yourself, what pressure drives a man to murder his blood with such ritual precision? Madness or something older? Something whispered in his ear by forces unseen, forces that thrive in isolation, where men are alone with their thoughts, or with the thoughts placed inside them. The official records say nothing of this. No trial, no grave markers, just a vanished family and a ranch sold cheap to new hands. But survivors, ranch hands, drifters, a neighbor who couldn't sleep through the night for decades, left behind their testimony. They spoke of the rancher staring into nothing for hours, as if listening to commands no one else could hear. They spoke of his wife begging him to stop. They spoke of children crying into the dirt as the last breath was stolen from them by soil. This is where we begin, not with madness, not with crime, but with the truth no man dares admit. There are systems older than governments, hungrier than kings, and colder than the grave. Systems that bend men like this rancher, until death becomes obedience. You think you understand isolation, a frontier, a cabin, a man alone with his land. But isolation is not absence. It is an instrument, and used correctly, it reshapes a man's interior world into a new architecture of obedience. The rancher did not wake one morning and decide to bury his family. He was assembled piece by routines, rituals, and doctrines that whispered authority into his veins. The frontier taught him self-reliance. Something else taught him submission. Small acts accumulate, a phrase repeated until it lodges in the skull, an old preacher's sermon on sacrifice, a foreman's offhand comment about hard choices for the greater good, a ledger entry that renders a human life a line item. No single moment is dramatic. The horror lies in the slope. Men are slid toward extremes by invisible gradients: isolation, debt, social contempt, rituals of obedience, and the slow erosion of private truth. The shovel was only the final instrument of a long, quiet engineering. There is a structural anatomy to this process. First, cognitive narrowing. The world reduces to binary imperatives: obey or perish, protect or betray. Second, social reinforcement. Neighbors and institutions reward the narrowed view and stigmatize doubt because uncertainty threatens the system. Third, ritual sealing. Repeated practices convert decision into habit and habit into identity. By the time the rancher dug, he no longer acted as an individual. He enacted a script written by forces larger than himself. Power secures itself more often through story than through chains. Narratives reframe cowardice as courage, theft as providence, murder as sacrifice. The rancher absorbed a tale that made the unthinkable seem logical, a moral cloak stitched to conceal atrocity. This is how institutions avoid culpability. They build stories that absorb responsibility and shape those who serve them. Understand the mechanics and you see the pattern in other places. Religious zeal converted soldiers into executioners. Economic pressure turned fathers into traffickers. Tribal ritual transformed citizens into automatons. Each time, men convinced themselves they answered a higher law, while the law was constructed to hide the truth. Obedience became the weapon, sacrifice the currency, and human hearts the collateral. We must not romanticize the man as a monstrous aberration, because that relieves the system. To see the danger clearly, name the ladder that led him down. Isolation, linguistic capture, ritual practice, narrative justification, and institutional reward. Remove any rung and the fall would have been different. Accumulate them all, and atrocity becomes inevitable. This is the lesson the rancher's grave forces upon us. Systems exist to break a man so they can profit from the pieces. Recognition is the first form of resistance. To know the mechanism is to unmake the obedience it depends upon. But knowledge alone is not enough. We will have to learn the counter-practices: environmental repair, linguistic reclamation, ritual inversion, and community accountability. These are not gentle tasks. They require confronting the story that comforts you, naming the narratives you live inside, and refusing the rituals that demand surrender. In the weeks after the burial, drifters told stories of the rancher standing at the fence at dawn, listening as if waiting for a command that only he could hear. Neighbors exchanged looks and moved on. Silence is a second crime. Do not let silence be your refuge. When you encounter the mechanism, name it aloud. When you feel your language narrow, stretch it. When ritual asks for your consent, withhold it. The difference between a man who resists and a man who obeys often rests in a single refusal spoken in a moment when all the world expected compliance. That refusal can break the chain, but ask yourself, who designs these chains? Who benefits from the silent ritual that drove a rancher to make a tomb out of his own home? The easy answer is madness, but madness is only the mask. Behind it stand institutions that profit from obedience disguised as faith, as duty, as honor. In 1870 Colorado, the frontier was not simply open land. It was a testing ground, a laboratory for control. Out there, no one could hear the screams. No one could question the rituals that turned men into tools. And no one could see the invisible architects pulling strings. Think of the preachers who rode on horseback into towns barely formed, planting sermons like seeds into unsettled minds. Their gospel was less about salvation and more about subjugation. Obedience to God meant obedience to the men who claimed his voice. To question them was to risk damnation. And so a rancher, beaten down by drought, debt, and isolation, hears whispers in the night. At first they sound like guilt, like fear. But repeated enough, fear transforms into command. He begins to believe that sacrifice is holy, that death can purchase redemption, that burying his family is not a crime, but a covenant. Behind the pulpit, there is another layer. Banks, land agents, and the machinery of expansion saw men like him as pawns. A rancher burdened with too much land and too little yield was disposable. His land would be absorbed, his tragedy written off as insanity, and the cycle would continue. Families vanish, institutions grow fat. The soil hides the blood, but the ledger reveals the truth. Profit was harvested from the corpses. This is how corruption hides itself. Not in shadow, but in daylight, cloaked in sermons, contracts, rituals, and laws. It is the same formula in every age. In Rome, the Senate cloaked slaughter in the name of empire. In Salem, pastors cloaked murder in the language of purity. In Colorado, a man cloaked his own crime in the illusion of divine command. Systems evolve, but the formula remains. Reduce a man's choices, starve him of alternatives, and feed him a story that makes obedience appear noble. Do not be fooled. The rancher's crime was his hand, but the design was not his. He was the executioner of someone else's story. And once you see that pattern, you cannot unsee it, because it does not live only in the past. It lives here now, wrapped around you, whispering in the same voice that bent his mind. Look beyond the single ranch, beyond Colorado's dust and silence, and you will see the same hand that guided him reaching into entire nations. Control begins with the individual, but matures when it scales into a culture. When private rituals become public policy, the rancher's cellar was a coffin for his family. Empires build cellars large enough for civilizations, and just as he dug by candlelight, convinced it was necessary, governments dig pits of war, famine, and indoctrination, always cloaking their work in the narrative of duty. Do you understand? This is not about one man's collapse. This is a blueprint, The same blueprint that turned ancient Egypt's citizens into laborers, worshipping the very stones that crushed their backs. The same blueprint that persuaded medieval peasants to hand over their food, their children, their very lives for promises of eternal reward they would never verify. The same blueprint that drives modern institutions to strip you of sovereignty with contracts, currencies, and doctrines you barely question. The genius of these systems lies in how they occupy your mind before they touch your body. First, they narrow your language. Words like duty, sacrifice, progress, faith, security. Each one is a key, and when used correctly, it locks your imagination inside the cage. Then, they stage the ritual. Military oaths, courtroom pledges, sacred prayers, anchoring obedience with repetition. Once that cage is sealed, the body follows. The shovel lifts, the gun fires, the law signs, and men tell themselves it was necessary. This is why the rancher obeyed the whisper. It was not madness, it was programming. And if you think yourself immune, ask, how many of your own choices are truly your own? How many desires were planted in you long before you believed they were yours? How many actions you call freedom are simply compliance disguised? History records his act as isolated horror, but history itself is written by the very systems that profit from the act. The cover-up was as important as the burial. They called him insane. They sold the land. They erased the graves. Because to admit the truth, that systems can bend a man so far he becomes the executioner of his own blood, would expose the design. But you are hearing it now. And once you see the design, you cannot return to blindness. The rancher's cellar was never just his. It was a mirror, reflecting the larger coffin that institutions build around us all. Symbols are the true shackles of men. Not chains of iron, not walls of stone. Symbols. A cross above a pulpit, a flag raised before an army, a ledger marked with red ink. These are the images that sink into the subconscious, bypassing reason, bypassing doubt, and fusing obedience directly into identity. The rancher's collapse was not spontaneous. It was orchestrated through the language of symbols he had been taught since childhood. Consider the cellar he dug. To him it was more than earth and timber. It became a vessel of sacrifice, a sanctified pit. The spade was not a tool, but a ritual instrument. His mind had been prepared long before the first strike of metal into soil. Sermons told him sacrifice was noble. Bibles told him obedience was salvation. Debt ledgers told him he owned less of his life each season. And so when the whisper came, there was no resistance left, only recognition. The whisper spoke the language his soul already understood. Sacrifice them, and you will be redeemed. This is how symbols command. They bypass argument. They are not meant to be questioned but absorbed. And once absorbed, they distort perception itself. A man sees his family not as flesh and blood, but as currency. He sees murder not as crime, but as offering. He sees soil not as dirt, but as altar. Tell me, how much of what you see each day is truly yours to interpret? Do you look at the flag and feel pride? Or do you feel the programmed pulse that someone stitched into you? Do you look at money and see paper? Or do you see the phantom power it has been given to rule your choices, your worth, your very survival? Scarcity is the hammer that drives these symbols deeper. Take away resources, take away certainty, and the human mind becomes pliable. That rancher had faced seasons of drought, debt collectors circling, sermons of fire and brimstone. Scarcity closed the walls around him, and symbols carved the door that led only one way, downward. This is how men are driven into obedience, not by brute force, but by deprivation married to imagery. Understand this, and you will never look at ritual, currency, or creed the same way again. They are not decorations. They are instructions, and the man who obeys them without question is already halfway into the cellar. Silence is the sharpest blade, not the silence of peace, but the silence engineered by isolation, where a man is left alone long enough to hear only the echoes planted inside him. The frontier was not merely wilderness. It was a crucible. Days without voices, nights without neighbors, months where the only dialogue was between a man and the thoughts that were not always his own. The rancher's cabin was not protection, it was confinement. Each wall amplified the whispers. Each night stretched the void wider. Isolation did not just surround him. It consumed him. When a man is starved of human reflection, his mind begins to fracture. Thoughts lose their boundaries. Fear becomes command. Desire becomes decree. He begins to mistake the voice of the system for his own conscience. That is the true genius of institutional control. It does not need to stand over you with a whip if it can colonize your silence. The rancher could have walked away. He could have abandoned the land, left the debts unpaid, disappeared into the mountains. But the whisper told him that silence was judgment, that there would be no escape. And with no one to challenge it, the whisper became law. Silence was also the weapon of his neighbors. They saw the signs, his hollow eyes, the endless digging, the strange sermons muttered under his breath. Yet they said nothing. They let the silence metastasize until it became complicity. You see, silence is rarely neutral. It is participation by absence. It is the second crime that makes the first possible. The grave was dug not only by his hands, but by every neighbor who watched and turned away. And here is where the mirror turns toward you. How many silences do you tolerate? How many wrongs have you witnessed only to excuse them as none of my concern? Each time you turn away, you add another shovel of dirt to someone else's grave. The system thrives on this silence. It counts on men refusing to confront, refusing to speak, refusing to risk their own safety to interrupt the ritual. That is why isolation is the perfect weapon. It breaks one man's mind, and it ensures the rest stay quiet. The cellar was not built by madness alone. It was constructed plank by plank from silence, both his and theirs. And this is the terrifying truth. Silence is not empty. It is filled with obedience. It is filled with consent. And in the end, it suffocates more surely than soil. Sacrifice, the most poisonous word ever offered to mankind. Wrapped in holiness, draped in ritual, whispered into men's ears until they believed that to destroy what they loved was not evil, but righteous. The rancher's act was not random. It was the logical conclusion of a story older than nations. He had been told since childhood that sacrifice cleanses, that blood spilled in devotion redeems, that God himself demanded offerings. So when the whisper came, it did not sound foreign. It sounded sacred. Understand this. The idea of sacrifice has always been the ruling class's greatest weapon. In ancient temples, priests slit the throats of animals and sometimes men, convincing the masses that such death kept the world turning. In kingdoms, kings demanded their subjects sacrifice labor, sons, daughters, even their lives for glory and duty. And in modern times, governments demand sacrifice of freedom, wealth, and dignity for the illusion of safety. Sacrifice is the word that sanctifies exploitation. It is the script that teaches obedience by making suffering appear noble. The rancher did not simply kill. He performed a ritual that had been rehearsed in his mind by generations of conditioning. Think of it, lowering his family into the pit one by one, as if laying offerings on an altar. Covering them in soil, not with rage, but with solemnity. That is the horror, the calmness, the ceremony. He believed he was delivering them, that his act was not murder, but transcendence. Sacrifice had hollowed him out until he no longer saw them as his children, his wife, his blood. They had become symbols, tokens to be exchanged for redemption. This is how systems weaponize language. They take words of violence, murder, theft, obedience, and they rename them sacrifice, tithing, service. And once renamed, the act is no longer resisted, but embraced. Men do not just comply. They volunteer. They march into wars, hand over their children, bury their families, convinced they are noble. Do not underestimate this poison. Even now you live inside its shadow. Every time you are told to sacrifice your time, your freedom, your individuality for the greater good, you are hearing the same voice that guided the rancher. The altar has changed, but the ritual is the same. And until you strip the word sacrifice of its sanctity, you will never see how deep the chains run. You must understand, ritual sacrifice was never simply belief. It was engineering. The ancients did not stumble into it by accident. They constructed it with precision, because nothing programs obedience like blood sanctified by ritual. When a people are conditioned to believe that surrendering their most precious possessions pleases higher powers, they no longer resist. They offer themselves willingly. This is not faith. It is control disguised as devotion. Look to the ruins of civilizations. In Mesoamerica, temples ran red with blood, each victim told they were the chosen offering. The crowd believed that the sun itself would die if sacrifice ceased. That terror made them complicit. In Phoenicia, children were cast into flames to appease gods that demanded innocence as currency. The screams were not mistakes. They were messages. Each cry reinforced the lesson. Your life is not yours, it belongs to the altar. And across the ancient world, the same pattern repeated. Sacrifice was the operating system, running quietly beneath religion and empire alike. The rancher in Colorado was not connected to these cultures by blood, but by blueprint. The same design had been repackaged through centuries of sermons, contracts, and laws. The ritual no longer required a temple priest. It required only a man alone, hollowed by debt, starving in isolation, desperate for redemption. He became priest and victim both, enacting a pattern written long before his birth. The cellar was his altar, the soil his offering, his family his lambs, and here is the revelation. The architects of control do not care whether the gods are real. They care only that you believe they are watching, for belief alone is enough to enslave. The system thrives on unseen eyes, invisible judges, punishments deferred until after death, where no man can verify the promise. The rancher buried his family because he believed someone or something was measuring his obedience. He was not serving madness. He was serving an empire of the unseen. Do you see the genius? Ritual does not only bind the present, it creates memory, trauma, and myth that ripple forward, carrying the obedience into the next generation. The child who watches a sacrifice does not question, it internalizes. And the man who buries his blood becomes the story whispered to the next man, proof that the altar demands loyalty. Sacrifice is not about gods, it is about governance. And the sooner you accept that truth, the sooner you see how many altars still stand around you, disguised as institutions, demanding you kneel. Suppression is not an afterthought. It is the second half of the ritual. What use is sacrifice if the truth of its design is exposed? The system survives, not by what it reveals, but by what it conceals. The rancher's story was buried twice, once in soil and once in silence. Neighbors did not write. Officials did not record. Newspapers reduced it to a whisper of insanity, and soon it was gone, erased from history, dissolved into rumor. That erasure was not mercy. It was strategy. You must realize, every age has its archivists, but also its censors. For every line of truth written down, 10 lines are cut, burned, hidden. Why? Because knowledge of the pattern would arm the next generation against it. If men knew that systems bend fathers into executioners, they might begin to resist the stories before they take root. So history is rewritten, tragedies reframed, records destroyed. Silence is not absence, it is curated. It is chosen. Think of the witch trials. Selim was not only an orgy of accusation, it was an experiment in memory control. After the hysteria burned itself out, the story was softened, made theatrical, until the true machinery of manipulation was forgotten. The same occurred in wars where atrocities were recast as necessary, in massacres reframed as progress in entire peoples vanished under the label of inevitable. The system is not content with obedience. In life, it demands obedience in death, rewriting the memory of the act until the truth itself is suffocated. The rancher's neighbors, who heard the cries muffled under earth, carried their silence like a second burial, and institutions rewarded that silence. Land was resold, wealth redistributed, order restored. No trial, no scandal, just another page turned, another horror consumed. Do you see? Suppression is not merely forgetting. It is active manipulation, the careful sculpting of collective memory until obedience becomes the only story left standing. And now, here is where the descent becomes dangerous. Because once you see the mechanics of suppression, you realize how much of your own world is curated. How many truths you were never allowed to hear. How many atrocities rewritten as myths. How many rituals disguised as culture. The rancher's family was buried beneath Colorado soil. But you live under the burial mound of centuries of lies. The question is no longer whether you believe this story. The question is, how many of your beliefs are stories engineered to bury you alive without ever touching the dirt? You have followed me this far, and now you stand at the threshold where most men turn back. It is easier to dismiss these things as myth, easier to retreat into the comfort of ignorance. But if you are still here, you already know this is not just the story of a rancher, or of ancient sacrifices, or of forgotten graves. This is your story. This is the system you were born into, the one that has stalked men for centuries, bending their wills, shaping their thoughts, burying their voices under the soil of silence. Do not mistake this for entertainment. You are not here by accident. Something in you is awake, something restless that refuses to be buried. And if you lean in closer, if you absorb what I am telling you, that part of you will never go back to sleep. But awakening has a cost, because once you see the patterns, you cannot unsee them. Every sermon, every pledge, every headline, every order given from on high, you will hear the whisper behind it, and you will recognize the shovel in your own hand. This is why I tell you, mark this moment. Because transformation does not come from passively listening. It comes from declaring, from choosing, from searing truth into your identity so it cannot be erased. Write it, twice. In the comments, in your own words, with your own hands. The phrase is simple, but its meaning is eternal. I will not be buried. Write it twice, so that the act becomes ritual, not just reaction. Write it twice, and you have stepped over the threshold into a different kind of manhood. The kind that refuses silence, refuses obedience, refuses to become the tool of a system older than empire itself. This is not symbolic. It is practice. It is how you train your mind to resist. The architects of control understand repetition. That is why they make you swear oaths, repeat prayers, salute flags. You must turn their weapon against them. Repetition is how you reprogram obedience into defiance. I will not be buried. Twice. That is your line in the sand. Your refusal spoken where others are silent. Because the truth is this. The rancher's tragedy is not locked in 1870. The same mechanisms move around you today. The same rituals demand your consent. And unless you anchor your will in words you choose, you will follow the script written for you and end in the same silence, the same soil. Look outward now, beyond the ranch, beyond the graves, beyond the silence of 1870, and tell me you don't see the same structure wrapped around your life today. The costumes have changed, but the script is the same. Where the preacher once whispered sermons of sacrifice, corporations now preach productivity. Where kings demanded blood for empire, governments demand your years, your taxes, your sons for wars you never chose. Where priests once claimed your soul, algorithms now capture your attention, feeding you narratives designed to bury you in distraction until you forget you were ever free. You are told to sacrifice your time for wages that buy less each year, to sacrifice your privacy for security, to sacrifice your individuality for belonging. Each demand framed as noble, each cost disguised as necessity, and you comply because the ritual has been sanctified. The flag waves, the anthem swells, the slogan glows on a screen. You kneel without even noticing your knees have touched the ground. The rancher's shovel is in your hand every time you surrender, without questioning the story behind the demand. You dig when you repeat slogans you don't believe. You dig when you let debt chains dictate your choices. You dig when you silence yourself to avoid conflict. When you swallow your doubts because authority wears a suit or a badge. The soil rises higher, and you wonder why the air feels thinner. The system has refined itself since the rancher's day. It no longer needs isolation in a cabin. It can isolate you in a crowd, drowning you in noise yet leaving you unheard. It no longer needs whispers in the night. It has perfected broadcast, filling every device with the symbols that program obedience. It no longer needs to erase atrocities with fire and ink. It can erase them with speed, flooding you with so many distractions that memory itself dissolves. This is the coffin scaled up, not one cellar in Colorado, but a global ritual where billions are offered, willingly daily on the altar of progress, and like the rancher's neighbors, most watch in silence. They sense something wrong, but they avert their gaze, telling themselves, this is how it has to be. That silence is the soil. That silence is the burial. You, however, you are no longer silent. You have spoken your refusal. Now you must carry it into the world, because the architects of control will not stop until every man is lowered into the pit. Debt is the modern altar, and contracts are the new scriptures. Where once blood was spilled in fire-lit temples, today signatures bleed on paper, and the sacrifice is stretched across a lifetime instead of a single moment. The rancher was strangled by debt before he ever touched a shovel. Each season of drought, each failed harvest, each visit from the collector chipped away at his will. He was taught to believe that he owed, not just money, but obedience. That belief became a cage no less deadly than the cellar. Understand this. Debt is not simply financial. It is psychological. It teaches you to see yourself as less than whole, as perpetually behind, as guilty until redeemed. And who controls redemption? The same institutions that issue the debt. They offer nooses disguised as lifelines, promising relief while tightening the rope. In 1870, the rancher was told his worth was measured in yield, in livestock, in acreage. When the numbers fell short, his existence itself was branded failure. So when the whisper told him to make sacrifice, he was already primed to believe it was the only way to balance the invisible scales. Today, the machinery is perfected. You are born into debt before you draw your first breath. National debt, inherited costs, systems that place you in deficit simply for existing. By the time you sign your first loan, the ritual is already complete. You have accepted that your future is collateral, that your labor belongs not to you but to the altar of repayment. And like the rancher, you begin to see the people around you, family, friends, even yourself, not as lives but as liabilities or assets. That is the true corruption. Debt erodes humanity, reducing love to numbers, freedom to obligations, existence to a ledger line. Contracts seal the spell. A line of ink binds more thoroughly than chains of iron, because the prisoner calls it consent. You sign believing you chose freely, when in truth every choice was structured to corner you. The system does not need to hold a gun to your head when scarcity, law, and ritual have already done the work. You kneel before the altar of contracts and you call it adulthood. The rancher's grave is not so distant, not so foreign. It is reflected in every man who spends his life paying for a house he never truly owns, working a job that consumes him, and silencing his rage because the system has convinced him he agreed. That is the brilliance of modern sacrifice. The coffin is legal, the burial voluntary, the silence total. Memory itself has been shackled. What is history, if not the story we are told to remember? And who decides which stories survive? Not the witnesses, not the dead. The victors, the institutions, the architects of obedience, they decide. The rancher's story was buried not just beneath soil, but beneath education. Children in Colorado grew up, never hearing of the family entombed under their own land. Teachers spoke instead of pioneering courage, of manifest destiny, of expansion. The horror was erased, because horror reveals design. And design, once revealed, becomes vulnerable. This is not an accident. Every empire understands. Control of memory ensures control of the future. Rome rewrote conquered gods into its pantheon, ensuring loyalty while erasing origins. The church edited gospels, cutting out the voices that did not serve hierarchy. Governments rewrite wars as victories, erasing massacres, painting slaughter as sacrifice for freedom. And you, yes you, grew up swallowing these revisions, reciting them as fact, repeating them as though they were your own thoughts. That repetition is the burial. You inherited a coffin called education. Do you see the cruelty? Memory is not allowed to heal. It is weaponized. Generations carry trauma without context, nightmares without names. Descendants of those sacrificed live with shadows, but are told those shadows do not exist. The system thrives on that dissonance. A man who cannot name his wound will never rebel against its cause. He will bury his rage, just as the rancher buried his family, believing his suffering is personal rather than structural. The textbooks you studied were altars in disguise. Dates, names, and narratives carefully chosen to direct your allegiance. They taught you who the heroes were, who the villains were, what causes were noble, what deaths were necessary. Never did they teach you the machinery. Never did they show you the system that repeats across centuries, bending men into pawns. Because if you saw the pattern, you might refuse to play. The rancher's act is called madness because that word absolves the system. But the system is never madness, it is design. And design is harder to kill. To break it, you must reclaim memory. Speak the forbidden. Record the silenced. Name the erased. Because memory is the true battlefield. If they own your past, they own your future. But if you reclaim your past, if you name the graves they buried in silence, then you begin to fracture the design. The question becomes, how much of your memory belongs to you, and how much belongs to the architects who wrote it for you? Trauma is not accidental. It is architecture. It is a design that survives beyond the flesh of those who first lived it, passed down like an heirloom, ugly, polished, and presented as inevitability. The rancher's act seeded something that did not die with him. It spread into the soil of his community, into the way children learned to fear night, into the posture of men who would later say nothing when they saw cruelty. That inheritance is intentional because fractured men are manageable men. Broken lineages are fertile ground for control. Listen closely. Fear is the currency that buys obedience across generations. A child who grows up watching a father shrink at the mention of debt learns before language to equate scarcity with shame. A daughter who senses her mother's reluctance to speak will learn silence as survival. These are the quiet rituals that ossify into character. They are passed not by proclamation but by mimicry, by the way anger is swallowed, the way shame is redirected inward, the way grief is privatized and then taught as weakness. Trauma becomes a teaching manual. Fear teaches compliance. Compliance teaches conformity. Conformity produces the next generation of silent diggers. This is why the system perpetuates itself. Institutions do not merely exploit present weakness. They harvest it, bottle it, and redistribute it forward. Schools that punish curiosity, churches that valorize submission, economies that reward long hours and punish dissent, all of these are mechanisms for recycling trauma. Each time a child learns to betray curiosity in favor of obedience, the apparatus gains another cog. Each time a family chooses silence over truth, it hands the system another tool. The cycle is deliberate because it works. You might feel powerless to stop a pattern that stretched back centuries. But patterns bend when pressure is applied in the right place. Trauma unravels when context is restored. When a man names his fear aloud, he strips it of supernatural authority. When a father refuses to pass on the lesson of silence, he interrupts the ritual. Resistance looks mundane, telling the truth in a room full of lies, showing tenderness where harshness is expected, choosing community over solitary pride. These acts are not soft. They are surgical. They cut the connective tissue that carries trauma forward. Understand this. Reclaiming the next generation is strategic warfare, not sentiment. It requires discipline and ritual of our own, rituals that restore voice, ritual that teach dissent as courage, ritual that celebrate refusal. Teach a son to say no. Teach a daughter that her voice is not dangerous. Build institutions, schools, clubs, brotherhoods that reward questioning instead of obedience. These are the counteralters. They are how you stop the recycling of fear and turn the inheritance into a weapon against the system that cultivated it. If you do not act, the pattern continues. If you do act, you fracture a chain that has stretched for centuries. The choice is yours and the cost is real. Choose wisely. There is a reason forbidden truths are whispered rather than shouted. Power survives in silence, and revelation is treated as heresy. The rancher who buried his family alive is remembered as a madman because that narrative protects the design. To admit otherwise, that his madness was cultivated, that it was structured, would force us to confront the institutions that profit from despair. And so, history calls him insane, and you nod along, never questioning who benefits from that version. But what happens when heresy spreads? What happens when a man refuses to accept the official story? He becomes dangerous because he disrupts the ritual of obedience. He refuses to bow at the altar of consensus. That is why revelation is always punished, burned as witchcraft, imprisoned as sedition, mocked as conspiracy. The label doesn't matter. The purpose is the same, silence. You live in a world where the greatest crime is not violence, not theft, not betrayal. It is pulling back the curtain. This is why you feel unease listening now. This knowledge is not safe. It stains you. You cannot unhear it, and once spoken, it calls you into a new role. You are no longer a passive observer of stories. You are a witness, and witnesses have responsibilities. The architects know this, which is why they train men to forget, to look away, to dismiss. If you deny the truth, you become harmless. If you accept it, you become a liability to their system. That is why every forbidden teaching carries a cost. The rancher was destroyed by his silence, but you have the chance to wield voice as a weapon, to say what others will not, to see patterns where others see randomness, to name corruption when others call it tradition. That act is not only rebellion, it is resurrection. It brings the dead back into memory, and it exposes the architect's design to the cold air of recognition. They cannot thrive in exposure. They demand shadows, and once you see them, once you speak them, you drag them into light. But revelation is only half the journey. Knowledge without transformation is indulgence. To carry forbidden truth means to live differently, to train yourself as one of the few men who cannot be bought with fear, debt, or silence. That is why I told you earlier to write the phrase, "I will not be buried alive." Write it again, twice, in the comments, not just for the algorithm, but to bind yourself to the vow. Anchor your identity in refusal. Mark the transformation with a ritual of words so you cannot retreat back into the comfort of blindness. This is your initiation. Do not waste it. Now we stand at the threshold and the question presses in. What will you do with what you have seen? The rancher's grave was not merely a pit in the Colorado earth. It was a mirror. A reflection of every man who allows silence, fear, and debt to carve his destiny. His shovel was guided not by madness alone, but by systems that you too are caught inside. He thought burying his family would free him from chains. In truth, he only became the perfect servant, broken, silenced, erased. The danger for you is not that you will dig a grave with your hands. The danger is that you are already digging. With every hour you give away without question, every debt you accept without fight, every lie from history you recite as truth, the soil piles quietly at your feet. One day you look up and realize the walls are too high to climb. That is the modern burial, alive, awake, but powerless. But listen carefully, there is another path. The very systems that enslave can be turned into blueprints for resistance. Just as they harvest trauma, you can harvest awareness. Just as they manipulate memory, you can restore it. Just as they wield ritual, you can forge your own. The difference between a prisoner and a master is not circumstance, it is vision. A master sees the design and bends it. A prisoner denies the design and is consumed by it. This story was never about one rancher in 1870. It was about you. About whether you will accept the coffin built for you, or whether you will learn to build altars of your own. Altars of truth, discipline, and unbreakable will. That is what frightens the architects most. A man who sees, a man who refuses, a man who does not pass on silence, but instead passes on fire. The choice is before you. To remain buried in the grave they dug for your life, or to rise clawing through the soil, eyes unblinded, voice unchained. One path leads to a legacy of silence, the other to a lineage of resistance. And once you choose, there is no return. So I ask you right now, look at your own life. The graves are waiting. Which one will bear your name?